Imagine a war plan so shocking, so risky, that even the most battle-hardened generals called it madness. A plan rejected not once, not twice, but 10 separate times. Pushed aside as impossible, unrealistic, even suicidal. And yet, this same insane idea would later become the turning point that crushed Nazi power in Europe and changed the future of the world forever. Tonight, on Clandestine Combat, you're stepping inside the tension, the doubt, and the dangerous gamble behind one of World War II's most unbelievable decisions. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear proves that sometimes the craziest idea is the one that wins the war. Before we move forward, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe to Clandestine Combat. It helps more people discover real wartime stories told with clarity and respect. And it keeps this channel bringing you powerful history every week. Now, let's step back into the darkest days of 1943. Europe was bleeding. Nazi forces controlled vast territory, stretching from France deep into Eastern Europe. Allied leaders knew one truth. If they didn't open a massive new front in Western Europe, the war could drag on for years, costing millions more lives. But launching a full-scale invasion across the English Channel was something military planners feared for good reason. The coastline of northern France was heavily fortified. Concrete bunkers, hidden artillery, endless machine gun nests. And behind it all, the full strength of Hitler's army waiting to crush any landing before it could even begin. Many commanders believed a direct assault would end in catastrophe. Memories of World War I? Disasters still haunted the massive casualties for only a few miles of ground. Some argued the Allies should attack somewhere safer, maybe the Mediterranean, slowly tightening the noose around Germany, instead of risking everything in one desperate strike. Others warned that if an invasion failed, morale across the Allied world could collapse overnight. Yet a small group of planners kept returning to the same forbidden thought. What if the only way to win was to attempt the impossible? What if a gigantic surprise landing in France could break Nazi defenses in a single blow? The idea sounded reckless. But war has a strange way of rewarding boldness. Inside secret strategy rooms, arguments grew intense. Maps covered the walls. Supply numbers, tide charts, weather reports, every detail, examined again and again. And each time the proposal surfaced, powerful voices shut it down. Too dangerous. Too early. Not enough ships. Not enough men. Not enough chance of survival. Rejected. Over and over again. But history often turns on the people who refuse to accept no. And soon, one determined commander would step forward, calm, steady, and willing to carry the weight of the most dangerous decision of the entire war. His choice would send thousands of soldiers toward the beaches of Normandy and into history itself. What happened next was not just a battle, it was a gamble with the fate of the free world. And in the next moments, you'll see how Dow slowly transformed into the most daring operation ever attempted in modern warfare. The man who would ultimately carry that burden was calm in a way that unsettled even experienced officers. He understood the numbers, the risks, and the brutal costs that failure would bring. Thousands of young soldiers would step off landing craft into gunfire within seconds. Entire divisions could vanish before noon. And if the invasion collapsed, Nazi Germany would gain precious time to strengthen its grip on Europe. That commander was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the decision in front of him was unlike anything in military history. Planning the invasion demanded secrecy on a scale the world had never seen. The operation itself would later be known as Operation Overlord, but at the time, even many senior officers didn't know the full picture. Every ship, every plane, every soldier had to arrive at the exact place and time. A single leak could doom the entire mission. German spies were everywhere, and Adolf Hitler was obsessed with stopping an Allied landing before it could succeed. So the Allies did something brilliant. Instead of only preparing for invasion, they prepared a deception. Fake armies made of inflatable tanks appeared in southern England. False radio messages filled the airwaves. Double agents fed Germany carefully crafted lies. The goal was simple but bold: convince Hitler that the real invasion would strike far from the true target. If the deception worked, German forces would be trapped in the wrong place when the real attack began. But even with deception on their side, the risks remained terrifying. Weather across the English Channel could shift without warning. Rough seas might sink landing craft. Low clouds could scatter paratroopers across enemy territory, and timing mattered down to the minute, because tides, moonlight, and visibility all had to align perfectly. Commanders waited and waited, knowing that delay meant more lives lost elsewhere in the war. Tension filled the Allied headquarters. Some officers still argued the invasion should be postponed for months. Others feared morale would collapse if soldiers kept preparing without action. Eisenhower listened to every argument, but deep down he knew something simple and painful: no plan would ever be perfectly safe. War never offered certainty, only choices. And then the moment arrived. Weather reports hinted at a narrow window, a brief break in the storms. It might be the only chance for weeks. Ships were loaded. Paratroopers prepared in silence. Engines waited in darkness along the English coast. Thousands of men sensed history closing in around them. Even if they didn't know the full plan, Eisenhower now faced the final question: launch the invasion, or call it off again, like so many times before. In the next chapter of this story, everything would depend on a single decision, and once that order was given, there would be no turning back. Silence settled over the command room as the final weather briefing ended. The forecast was uncertain, the seas still rough, the clouds unpredictable. Nothing about the moment felt safe. Around the table, senior officers searched one another's faces, hoping someone else would speak first, hoping the impossible responsibility might shift away from their shoulders. But everyone in that room understood the truth. The decision belonged to one man alone. Eisenhower stepped outside for a moment, away from the maps and the pressure. Cold air moved across the dark coastline, carrying the distant sound of thousands of soldiers preparing for something they could not fully imagine. Many of them were barely out of school. Some had never seen combat. Yet, within hours, they would charge into fortified defenses built to destroy them. The weight of those lives pressed heavily on him. History would remember victory or failure, but he would remember the faces. When he returned inside, the room grew still. No long speech came. No dramatic announcement. Just a quiet sentence that changed the course of the war. The invasion would go forward. Orders moved instantly through the chain of command. Dot signals flashed across radios. Engines roared to life along the English coast. One of the largest armadas ever assembled began to move into the darkness. Ships stretching across the water farther than the eye could see. Above them, aircraft formed endless lines in the night sky, carrying paratroopers toward enemy territory. What had been only an argument on paper was now unstoppable reality. For the soldiers packed inside landing craft, time slowed in a strange way. Some checked their gear again and again, even though nothing had changed. Others stared quietly at the floor, lost in thoughts of home. A few tried to joke, forcing nervous laughter that faded quickly in the cold air. Everyone understood the danger, even if no one spoke it aloud. Training could prepare the body, but nothing truly prepared the mind for the first seconds of battle. As the fleet pushed closer to the French coast, rough waves slammed against the small boats, drenching the men with freezing water. Seasickness spread through the ranks, adding misery to fear. Darkness still covered the horizon, but somewhere ahead waited concrete bunkers, hidden guns, and defenders ordered to fight to the last bullet. Surprise was the Allies' greatest hope. If that surprise failed, the beaches could become a graveyard before sunrise. Then, in the early hours before dawn, the first phase began in the sky. Paratroopers leaped into blackness, scattered by wind and cloud, landing far from their intended positions. Small groups formed in confusion, cut off from commanders, surrounded by enemy territory. Yet instead of collapsing, many of them adapted instantly, turning chaos into opportunity. Bridges were seized. Roads were blocked. German movement slowed. The invasion, fragile as it was, had begun to take hold. Out at sea, the armada kept moving forward, wave after wave of soldiers approaching the shoreline. Dawn was coming, and with it, the moment that planners had feared for years. In just minutes, the front doors of the landing craft would drop, and everything would change forever. Gray lights slowly spread across the horizon, revealing the outline of the French coastline ahead. For many of the soldiers packed inside the landing craft, this was the first clear look at the place where their fate would be decided. The sea was still rough, waves crashing against metal hulls, engines struggling to hold formation. No one spoke much now. The closer they came to shore, the more silence replaced nervous conversation. Every man was alone with his thoughts, counting the seconds without meaning to. Then, the first explosions thundered across the water. Allied naval guns opened fire, sending massive shells screaming toward the fortified cliffs and bunkers. The sound was overwhelming, shaking the air and sea together. Columns of smoke and dirt rose along the shoreline, briefly hiding the defenses behind a wall of fire. For a moment, hope flickered through the landing craft. Maybe the bombardment had worked. Maybe the enemy guns were gone. But as the boats pushed closer, reality revealed itself in flashes of light. Machine gun fire cut across the waves. Artillery shells crashed into the water, throwing metal and men into the air. The defenses were still alive, waiting, watching, ready. Any illusion of safety disappeared instantly. What lay ahead was not a landing. It was survival. Ramps dropped into cold surf and chaos. Soldiers rushed forward through deep water, weighed down by gear, struggling to keep balance as bullets struck around them. Some fell before reaching dry sand. Others pressed on, driven by training, fear, and the simple instinct to move forward rather than freeze. The beach filled with smoke, shouting, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoing against the cliffs. Units became scattered within minutes. Officers searched for their men through confusion and noise. Radios failed, plans dissolved. The perfectly timed operation designed in quiet rooms across the sea was now replaced by something raw and unpredictable. Small groups of soldiers made decisions on their own, crawling behind obstacles, dragging the wounded, pushing inch by inch toward the bluffs above the shore. Time lost meaning in the struggle. Minutes felt like hours. Every few yards gained came at terrible cost, yet something powerful was happening beneath the fear. Despite the chaos, despite the losses, the line did not break. Men kept moving. Step by step, they found gaps in the defenses, weak points no planner could have predicted. Courage spread quietly, not in speeches, but in actions. One soldier rising, another following, momentum building where none should have existed. Slowly, unbelievably, the impossible began to change shape. What had looked like certain disaster started to resemble fragile progress. A few troops reached the base of the cliffs. Others silenced key gun positions. Openings appeared where walls once seemed unbreakable. The battle was far from won. In many places, survival still hung by a thread, but the defenders had lost something important: the certainty that the invasion would fail at the water's edge. And once that certainty cracked, the entire course of the day began to shift in ways no one on either side could fully control. On one stretch of shoreline, the struggle became especially brutal. Later, the world would know this place as Omaha Beach. But in those first terrifying hours, it was simply a storm of sand, steel, and survival. Defensive fire poured down from high ground that gave the German forces a deadly advantage. Landing craft were torn apart before reaching shore. Entire units were pinned behind narrow strips of sand with nowhere to hide. For a time, it seemed the earlier fears of total disaster might come true after all. Yet war is rarely decided in a single moment. Small acts of courage began to shift the balance in ways no grand strategy could predict. Individual soldiers, separated from their commanders, started organizing whoever was near them. Engineers crawled forward under fire to clear obstacles. Medics moved again and again into open danger to reach the wounded. Officers who survived the landing pulled scattered men together and pointed them toward the cliffs. No single action won the beach, but thousands of determined choices slowly created momentum. Naval ships offshore adjusted their fire with incredible precision, bringing heavy guns closer to friendly lines than ever considered safe. Shells crashed into fortified positions that had seemed untouchable only minutes before. Smoke thickened across the battlefield, giving advancing troops brief seconds of cover. Bit by bit, the wall of resistance weakened. What had begun as near hopelessness slowly transformed into fragile possibility. By midday, the situation remained uncertain, but something fundamental had changed. Allied forces were no longer trapped at the water's edge. Small groups had climbed the bluffs. Defensive guns that once dominated the shoreline were falling silent. Paths, inland narrow, dangerous, but real, were beginning to open. The invasion that critics had called madness was still alive. Across other landing zones, similar struggles unfolded with different rhythms of chaos and success. Some beaches saw faster breakthroughs, while others demanded hours of relentless effort. Communication remained broken in many places, leaving commanders unsure whether the overall operation was succeeding or collapsing. From a distance, the battlefield looked like confusion. Up close, it looked like endurance. And far away from the gunfire, leaders waited for news that arrived slowly and often incomplete. Reports mixed victory with loss, progress with uncertainty. No one yet knew whether this gamble would secure a foothold in Europe or become one of the greatest tragedies of the war. The answer was still being written in smoke along the French coast. But as the afternoon stretched on, a quiet realization began to form. Against enormous odds, the line had held. The landing had not been pushed back into the sea. Somehow, the impossible idea rejected so many times was beginning to prove itself real. And if the Allies could keep pushing inland before German reinforcements arrived, this single day might reshape the entire future of the war. As daylight slowly began to fade, the battlefield revealed the true cost of what had happened. The sand was scarred by explosions, the air heavy with smoke, and the sound of distant gunfire still echoed inland where fighting continued beyond the beaches. Medics worked without rest, moving from one wounded soldier to another, often with little more than determination and fading supplies. Engineers struggled to bring equipment ashore through damaged landing zones, knowing that without armor and artillery, the fragile foothold could still be crushed by a determined counterattack. Nothing about the situation felt secure, yet the simple fact that Allied forces remained on the ground marked a turning point that could no longer be ignored. German commanders faced confusion of their own. Reports from the coast arrived broken and delayed, making it difficult to understand where the main invasion had truly landed. Some leaders believed the attack might still be a diversion, a trick designed to pull defenses away from another location. That uncertainty slowed their response at the exact moment speed mattered most. Hours, past precious hours, the Allies used to push men, weapons, and supplies onto the shore. In war, time can be as powerful as any weapon. And on this day, time was beginning to shift sides. Inland fighting grew fierce as scattered units tried to link together into a continuous front. Hedgerows, narrow roads, and unfamiliar terrain turned every advance into a careful, dangerous crawl. Progress was measured not in miles, but in fields and crossroads. Still, momentum once almost impossible to imagine was slowly building. Soldiers who had survived the landing now carried a different energy. Fear had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. They were no longer wondering if they would reach the shore. Now they were determined to hold it. Behind the front lines, an even greater race had begun. Supply ships crossed the channel in endless rotation, bringing fuel, ammunition, medical gear, and reinforcements. Commanders understood a harsh truth. Winning the landing meant nothing if they could not sustain the army that followed. Every crate unloaded, every vehicle assembled, every radio connected pushed the invasion one step further from failure and closer to permanence. The operation that once seemed like a single desperate gamble was transforming into a full-scale liberation. Night approached with uncertainty still hanging over everything. Counterattacks were expected. Losses were heavy. The final outcome remained unknown. Yet one fact stood firm against the darkness. The Allies had done what many believed could never be done. They had broken through the edge of Fortress Europe and planted a foothold that refused to disappear. And in that fragile foothold lay the beginning of the end for Nazi control in the West, setting in motion a chain of events that would grow larger, faster, and more unstoppable with every passing day. Through the night, the sounds of battle never fully disappeared. Gunfire cracked in the distance. Artillery rumbled beyond the hedge, and the low hum of engines crossing the channel continued without pause. For the soldiers on the ground, sleep was almost impossible. Some tried to rest in shallow foxholes carved into unfamiliar soil, gripping their weapons even in exhaustion. Others stayed awake on watch, eyes fixed on dark fields where an enemy counterattack could emerge at any moment. Survival had brought them this far. But survival alone would not finish the mission. Commanders worked under dim lights, spreading new maps across makeshift tables as updated reports finally began to form a clearer picture. The landing had succeeded but only barely in some sectors. Units were scattered, supplies uneven, and defensive lines fragile. If German armored divisions struck quickly with full force, the foothold could still collapse into chaos. Every decision now carried enormous weight, because the next 24 hours might determine whether this daring invasion became a historic breakthrough, or a costly failure remembered for generations. Yet something unexpected was happening beyond strategy and numbers. The psychological balance of the war had begun to shift. For years, Nazi forces had appeared unstoppable across continental Europe, pushing enemies back again and again. Now, for the first time in the West, that image was cracking. Allied troops were not retreating. They were digging in, expanding, and preparing to push forward. Even small advances carried enormous meaning, proving that the fortified coastline could be broken and held. Reinforcements arriving overnight strengthened that fragile confidence. Fresh soldiers stepped onto the same beaches where fierce fighting had raged only hours earlier, seeing the wreckage but also the proof of success. Vehicles rolled ashore. Artillery positions formed. Communication lines slowly improved. Piece by piece, the invasion was transforming from a desperate landing into a growing army with the power to move inland. Momentum in war is invisible at first, but once it builds, stopping it becomes incredibly difficult. German hesitation, caused by confusion and conflicting intelligence, continued to, by the Allies' priceless time. Orders moved slowly through rigid command structures, and uncertainty about where the main attack might come next delayed the full response. By the time stronger counterattacks could be organized, the narrow window of opportunity was already beginning to close. The beaches were no longer weak entry points. They were becoming fortified gateways for liberation. Morning light would soon reveal a battlefield forever changed. What began as an idea dismissed again and again as madness had survived its most dangerous test. But survival was only the beginning. Ahead lay weeks of brutal fighting across the countryside, towns, and cities of occupied Europe. Victory was still far away, and the cost would continue to rise. Even so, a quiet truth had emerged from the chaos of the first day. The impossible had been attempted, and it had not failed. By the second day, the scale of what had begun was becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as scattered survival along the shoreline was turning into coordinated movement inland. Engineers cleared paths for vehicles, infantry units linked their positions, and supply lines fragile but functioning stretched back across the sea. Every passing hour strengthened the foothold that so many had believed could never exist. The invasion was no longer balanced on the edge of collapse. It was beginning to breathe, expand, and prepare for the long struggle ahead. Still, nothing about the advance was easy. The countryside presented new dangers at every turn. Thick hedgerows formed natural walls that hid defenders only yards away. Narrow roads forced troops into exposed movement. Every field had to be treated as a potential ambush. Progress slowed to a crawl, measured in hard-fought ground rather than sweeping victories. Soldiers who had imagined rapid liberation now faced a grinding campaign where patience and endurance mattered more than speed. Yet morale carried a different energy than before the landing. Surviving the beaches had changed something deep inside the men pushing forward. Fear was still present. War never removes it, but it no longer controlled every decision. Confidence, quiet and cautious, began to grow. They had faced the worst storm imaginable and remained standing. That knowledge traveled through the ranks more powerfully than any speech. Far beyond the battlefield, the impact was already spreading. News of the successful landing moved across the Allied world, lifting spirits that had endured years of uncertainty and loss. Occupied nations heard whispers of hope returning from the western horizon. Resistance movements prepared for the moment they had waited for in silence. The invasion was not just military progress, it was psychological shock, breaking the illusion that Nazi control over Europe was permanent. Even enemy commanders could sense the shift. Defensive plans designed to throw the invaders back into the sea were becoming harder to execute with each passing hour. Reinforcements arriving too late faced an enemy already digging deeper, growing stronger, and refusing to retreat. The narrow chance to erase the landing was slipping away, replaced by a far more dangerous reality: a sustained campaign that would pull resources, attention, and strength into a battle Germany could not easily escape. And still, the fighting ahead promised to be brutal. Town by town, road by road, the cost would continue. No single victory would end the struggle quickly, but the direction of the war had changed. And that change began the moment one impossible idea was finally allowed to move forward. What remained now was the long push that would determine whether this fragile beginning could truly grow into the liberation of an entire continent. Days turned into weeks, and the narrow strip of land taken at such terrible cost slowly expanded into a true front line. What had once been scattered units fighting for survival was now a growing force, pushing deeper into occupied territory. Bridges were secured, supply depots established, and air support increased overhead. The invasion was transforming from a desperate foothold into an unstoppable pressure that forced enemy defenses to bend rather than hold. But victory still felt distant to the soldiers moving through the countryside. Every village could hide resistance. Every crossroads might be defended. Advances often came slowly, followed by sudden bursts of violence that reminded everyone the war was far from over. Rain turned fields into mud, slowing vehicles and exhausting infantry. Fatigue settled into the ranks, not just from combat, but from the constant tension of never knowing when the next attack would begin. War was no longer a single dramatic landing, it was endurance measured day after day. Even so, the broader picture was shifting in ways impossible to ignore. Enemy resources were being pulled toward the Western Front, weakening their ability to fight elsewhere. Pressure from the East continued to grow at the same time, creating a tightening vice that became harder to escape with each passing week. The bold gamble that once seemed reckless was now revealing its deeper purpose. It had forced a decisive confrontation that changed the balance of the entire conflict. Commanders who had once feared catastrophe began to recognize something remarkable. The very risks that made the plan seem insane were also what made success so powerful. Surprise, scale, and determination had combined at exactly the right moment. Had the invasion been smaller or delayed longer, the outcome might have been very different. History often appears inevitable when looking backward, but in truth, it hangs on fragile decisions made under pressure, without certainty, and without guarantees. For the soldiers on the ground, however, history felt personal rather than strategic. It lived in the faces of friends beside them, in letters carried from home, and in the quiet hope that the suffering might finally be moving toward an end. Each mile gained carried meaning beyond maps and reports. It meant one step closer to finishing the war that had taken so much from the world. The idea rejected 10 times had not ended the conflict in a single stroke. Instead, it opened the door to the final chapter, a long, costly, but irreversible march toward victory. And as that march continued, the question was no longer whether the gamble had worked. The only question left was how much more it would demand before the war was finally over. As the final months of the war approached, the meaning of that single decision became clearer with every passing day. The foothold carved into the coast had grown into a relentless advance that no defense could fully stop. Cities once held under occupation began to fall back into Allied hands. Supply lines stretched confidently across the channel. Air power filled the skies with near constant presence. What had started as a fragile gamble in darkness was now visible to the entire world as unstoppable. momentum moving toward the heart of Nazi power. For the soldiers who had survived since the landing, the feeling was complex. There was pride in what had been achieved, but also exhaustion that ran deeper than words. Too many friends were missing from the ranks. Too many memories were tied to fields and roads far from home. Victory, when it finally came into view, did not feel like celebration at first. It felt like relief, quiet, heavy, and deeply human. The end of war is rarely loud for those who carry its weight the longest. Looking back, historians would study the planning, the deception, the weather, and the strategy. They would debate which moment mattered most and which decision changed everything. Yet beneath all analysis remained a simpler truth. Courage had met uncertainty and moved forward anyway. An idea dismissed again and again as impossible had been given one final chance. And because of that chance, the course of history shifted. This is why stories like this continue to matter today. They remind us that history is not only shaped by perfect plans or guaranteed outcomes, it is shaped by people willing to act when success is unclear, when fear is real, and when the cost is unknown. Sometimes the future changes, not because something feels safe, but because someone decides it is necessary. If this story made you see history in a new way, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of this turning point surprised you the most? And if you want more powerful untold wartime stories, told with clarity and respect, make sure you resubscribed to Clandestine Combat and share this video with someone who values real history. Your support keeps these stories alive for the next generation to understand. Because in the end, the most unbelievable ideas are not remembered for how risky they sounded in the beginning, but for how completely they changed the world once they finally succeeded.